Welcome to you all to Elevate Ethics 2015, a dialogue on the state of ethical leadership in American business today. We're delighted you have joined us for this evening, which should turn out to be a robust and very informative and enjoyable discussion. I'm Dan Sweeney, the director of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics here at the Daniels College of Business. This institute, as well as events like this, would be impossible without the support and participation of our sponsors and our partners. You've seen their logos and such going on the wall here. I'd like to introduce them formally at this point. Our charter sponsors are CoBank, who is our inaugural charter sponsor and who helped us get the Institute underway a couple of years ago. Another charter sponsor is Level 3 Communications. And Level 3 is helping us tonight by providing us with a high-speed global internet platform so we can live stream this event to anyone, anywhere in the world who wants to participate. We have two hosting sponsors, IHS Incorporated and the Daniels Fund. Two program sponsors who help us put on programs throughout the year, CH2M Hill, the Denver office of Deloitte LLC, Square 2 Financial, and a number of members and friends who help us out individually. Several important partners of the Institute include the Colorado chapter of the National Association of Corporate Directors, the Colorado chapter of the Financial Executives International, the Voices of Experience speaker series here at Daniels, and the University of Denver's chapter of Net Impact, which is a global organization of MBA students. So a hearty thank you to all these sponsors and all these partners of the Institute that enable us to get our work done here. I would also like to acknowledge the support of our colleagues at the in the University of Denver and the Daniels College of Business senior leadership team who have joined us this evening. Mr. Doug Scrivener is chairman of the Board of Trustees of the university, and Dr. Brent Crite is dean of the Daniels College of Business. And Brent's around here somewhere. There he is. So thank you for your support too. So now why are we here? Why are we gathered here tonight? Well, I know I am, and I suspect you are all aware of the reportage and the editorial opinion and the commentary on the blogosphere consistently criticizing the state of business ethics and of ethical leadership in American corporations. Public opinion polls consistently report the low esteem in which our businesses and our business leaders are held by the general public. But the public very seldom hears anything about these issues from the business community itself. So far, it's been kind of a one-way broadcast. It's our goal here on this Elevate Ethics event to provide a forum and a voice for that discussion. We intend this dialogue to achieve three goals. First, to provide a platform for corporate leaders to comment on how they feel about the state of ethical leadership in business today, to add your voice to the discussion. Secondly, to provide a forum for the exchange of ideas on the development of ethical leadership in our organizations. And finally, to actually help advance the cause and make the case for higher standards of ethical leadership in our economic institutions. To help us develop this dialogue and pursue these goals, we're very fortunate to have an excellent panel with us tonight, three outstanding senior operating executives from three outstanding companies here in Denver. We also have a skilled and articulate moderator to help keep the discussion on point and well balanced. Dr. Ted Willey is founder and president of Ted Willey and Associates, an internationally recognized business advisory and consulting firm with serving clients in a wide variety of industries from airlines to oil and gas. For 3 decades, Dr. Willey has provided executive and board leadership teams with advice and counsel on improving operating effectiveness and corporate performance. Ted is an accomplished facilitator, a nationally recognized professional speaker, and the award-winning author of The Power of Choice, a guide to personal and professional self-management. Ted holds a doctorate degree from George Washington University with a specialty in executive leadership development and human capital management. He is a member of the National Association of Corporate Directors and serves as a director and advisor to several nonprofit and for-profit firms and boards. So please welcome our Elevate Ethics discussion leader tonight, Dr. Ted Willie. Ted?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. How are you this evening? It's a little wet, we understand. We thank you so much for making the extra effort on this somewhat wet night, but for those of us, obviously, who live in Colorado, we know we need the water, correct? We do need to have as much as we can get without too much damage. Thank you very much again for coming. I'm looking forward to moderating this evening's discussion and dialogue. We will not only be leveraging off of the talent of these extremely talented individuals as we begin the initial dialogue and answering some important questions, but we want to engage you as well. And we really would like you to begin to think about some of the questions that you think are really important as we discuss this issue of ethical leadership in American business. We look at ethical leadership as an aligned set of behaviors that are completely and agreed upon in terms of what is probably right and wrong according to that particular organization and to that culture of that organization and to the society that it's in. We know that there are differences of opinions, and we're looking to learn tonight from you as well as from our distinguished panelists. Let me take a moment and introduce our panelists, if I may. Just take a moment and really understand that they have given up their time. They bring a tremendous amount of knowledge and experience from all parts of our industry, business industry, from the public sector, from the private sector, and I think you're really going to enjoy their comments. First of all, I want to introduce to you Secretary Federico Pena, and he was an independent director on the Wells Fargo Board of Directors, a senior advisor at Vestar Capital Partners, and former U.S. Secretary of both Energy and Transportation during the Clinton administration. Would you please welcome Secretary Pena? I'd like to introduce to you, Teresa Taylor is our next panelist, and she is the CEO of Blue Valley Advisors, an independent director on the T-Mobile, NiSource, and First Interstate Bank System Boards of Directors, and the former COO at Quest Communications, and the author of The Balance Myth. Please welcome Teresa also. Scott Key is our third panelist. He is the President and Chief Executive Officer of IHS Incorporated. Previously, Mr. Key served as Chief Operating Officer for IHS and as Senior Vice President of Global Products and Services. Please welcome Scott this evening also. One of the things that's most important is in our preparation for tonight's discussion is that everyone is so passionate about this topic. Everyone that we talk about, it seems more and more relevant every single day. I'd like to take a moment and kind of the first stage of tonight's event is give each of our panelists an opportunity to share some oversight and some thoughts about how they view this whole issue of ethical leadership. So what I'd like to do is ask Secretary Pena if you would be first and take 5 or 6 minutes and share some thoughts that you might have.
I'm happy to do it. I will try to only take 5 or 6 minutes.
I have the hook.
I'm sure you do. Seriously, first of all, let me congratulate the university for hosting this session and thank all of you for being here on a rainy night to listen to us talk about what I consider to be an extraordinarily important issue, not only facing our nation, but social society and obviously corporations in the country. My thought about how we should think about the importance of focusing on ethical behavior in corporate America is affected by the broad social milieu in which we now live. So think about this. People are now debating the disparity of wealth between the dwindling middle class and the very, very wealthy. People are focused very much on government oversight of companies that are involved in unethical behavior. There are now more rules and regulations on corporate America, including not just management, but boards of directors. Today's paper, for example, if you read the Denver Post, had two examples of a couple of situations here in the state where one major corporation has settled a major accusation without admitting to any wrongdoing about involving Social Security, almost a $500 million settlement, initially started by two whistleblowers in the company. And we'll talk about whistleblowers in a second, because that's a whole new factor that a lot of corporations did not have to deal with 10 or 15 years ago, but it's now here and very much alive. And thirdly, the role of shareholders, at least in public companies, and the way they are challenging management teams and boards of directors is extraordinary today, whether it's challenging proxy access or voting on compensation or all sorts of issues. All of those pressures, I think, compel management and boards of directors to be more focused on ethical behavior than ever before. And those companies that do it as a business imperative, not because it's simply the right thing to do, will succeed. And companies that don't pay attention to misconduct and unethical behavior will be punished in many ways by consumers, by social media, by millennials who are more active today and more vigilant about corporate behavior than I've seen in 15 or 20 years. So those are my opening thoughts about how we should think about this, but most importantly, I'm glad we're focusing on it because it's a very, very important issue.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Teresa, your thoughts?
Great. Well, also thank you for taking the time, everybody, for this evening, because it is, as you mentioned, a very important subject. I have a thought that I just want to lay out there, really, to open, because we're going to talk about a lot of things later. And that is, when we say that a corporation is unethical, what are we really saying? Because a corporation is made up of individuals, and there's people that have made those ethical or unethical decisions. And I'd like to see some of that conversation turn on to, it is about individuals. I mean, a corporation is not just this thing that becomes unethical, it's the people in it. And somehow as we move forward, each one of us need to hold each other accountable for what is and isn't ethical, which is an interesting point then also of how is that defined? Is that defined by our society? Today, something might be unethical that was perfectly fine 20 years ago, or the other way around. So tonight I hope that we can focus a lot on, this is all about us. Each one of us can change this. Each one of us can impact this. It's not the corporation, it's the people in it, whether it be at the top, in the middle, or all the way through the company. So I'm hoping we can really come to some real things that can change. And I think each one of us in this room are able to make that change and impact that.
Thank you very much. Scott, your thoughts?
And I'll build on that because it is about people. And there's a tension across constituents, because ethics is, there's a responsibility across a broad base of constituents. It used to be shareholders. So we have owners, and those are people as well. Owners in businesses who were interested in driving profit. And I think there was a point in time where that was sufficient. The world has definitely evolved to a much broader set of constituents. You start to hear terms like sustainability, and in fact the investment community, significant portions of the investment community are talking about sustainable investment and sustainable corporations, Dow Jones Sustainability Index. So there's a new responsibility around companies and their behavior. But then there's also a dialogue about permission to operate in local communities. We hear that a lot in the heavy industry. Do I have the permission to operate? And that's no longer just shareholders. It's a set of constituents which involves local communities. So I think it is about people, and it can't be a one-dimensional discussion. Because certainly any one of those constituents, whether it's shareholders, whether it's local communities, whether it's organizations who have certain interests, we all need to be heard as part of the dialogue. But then it's a balance for corporations. And sometimes these are difficult trade-offs. I know we're going to get into those questions, but sometimes that balance is difficult to execute well, given the complexity now.
There's always a trade-off. You're talking about in terms of the benefit analysis, the risk-benefit analysis regarding those decisions.
That's right.
Let's take a specific question, and let me ask each of you a specific question, and I'm going to start with Teresa. But I'd hope both of you would also jump in as we ask this as well. One of the first things that I'd like to say is, to what extent do you believe the standards of ethical behavior and leadership in the U.S. business community have changed materially over the past 15 to 20 years?
So I do think they've changed materially for a number of reasons. The first was what was mentioned earlier, is that the social media pressure and the social media access is so large that you know instantly when you're an executive in a company if people are happy or not, and if they think you're doing the right thing. I mean, it is so fast and so quick that it forces individuals in a company to elevate and to be aware. I mean, in my own role, I can think of, I was never aware of the decisions and what that impact was doing 20 years ago as compared to now. It's just so quick. So I think it has gotten better. It doesn't feel like that to us sometimes because we now know everything, right? We all know things that we didn't know before, so now we think it's terrible. I'm not so sure that it wasn't going on anyway. It's just that we didn't know about it.
didn't know about
and it wasn't in that place. So I think social media has made it, has raised the bar for everyone. And also, we've had government, involvement.
In raising the bar, does that mean holding us more accountable?
Holding us more
and
accountable.
more answerable?
Right. And instantly. That
Yes.
you need to respond quickly. It's not a issue where you can go and think about it for a couple months and come back out with something. I mean, within hours, as an executive in a company, you now have to respond if any of your constituents are not happy, whichever it might be.
Scott, your thoughts on to what extent has ethical behavior changed over the past 15 or 20 years?
Well, first, it's a connected loop. So as you said, you've got immediate response on behavior, and that ties back to brand, reputation, and shareholders. So there is actually a very tight loop of feedback back to value. And you see corporations and their shareholders, which are all people, quickly punished when the actions are deemed inappropriate, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly. But what's interesting, and this is back to the cynical view, it's easy to have a cynical view if you look at SOX and a post-Enron world for corporations, and you say how many people have been sent to jail. And the answer would be 0. I think as of today, it's still 0. As a CEO, I know I sign documents every quarter attesting to a significant number of things inside the corporation. So that gets your attention, the CFO and the CEO. But I wouldn't say that is what's driven the change. If I look at our company, it's driven a cultural change. And that's where, the cynical part of who's been sent to jail, well, nobody. But if you look inside corporations, every single employee, all of the people, because of compliance, are required to be educated on what is ethical behavior. And quarterly and annually, every colleague has to go in and get trained. They have to take tests. And when it starts with me doing that, and then asking all of them to do that, it changes the dialogue. And I think the tone from the top, maybe a decade ago, could easily have been profit, and then do what's required to drive profit. I think the tone from the top now, because of all this regulation, maybe hasn't been lawsuits and jail time, but what has been is a cultural change inside corporations. And I think maybe that's the biggest change, and I really like the idea, Teresa, of the loop that didn't exist with regard to social responsibility.
Terrific. Secretary?
Well, I can say that on the boards that I sit, we discuss this all the time. We are always aware of federal oversight. The federal oversight today under a number of federal agencies is extraordinary compared to what it was 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Just take Dodd-Frank and the amount of inspection and spotlight that is put on audit committees, COOs who have to sign documents, CEOs who have to attest to accuracy of financial statements, the pressure on independent accounting firms and internal auditors. So I would say today, because of not just social media and because of mistakes of the past that have caused Congress to pass strenuous laws, there is a lot of attention and focus on ethics and ensuring that employees are not involved in inappropriate behavior. I think the challenge becomes when companies become very, very large, and you've got several hundred thousands of employees. It is almost impossible to regulate the conduct of every employee, no matter how wonderful the culture might be, no matter what the tone at the top is, no matter how independent the board is. You got people all over the world, and look at the London Whale, for example, for J.P. Morgan, an example of someone who sort of wasn't given the right kind of oversight, and that happens when you have a very large corporation. But I think we've simply got to work harder to make sure that everybody is complying with the law and not involved in any kind of unethical behavior.
So
I'm
the one
hearing-
thing the one thing I see change that's happened is you're not going to see unethical behavior in financial reporting very much anymore. But now the focus is turned to, are you treating your customers right? Have you put the right products in the market? Are they environmentally safe? Are you disposing of any materials correctly? So I feel like it's taken a twist where it used to be just about the numbers. You know, are your financials right? Are you cheating on something? Are you reporting your revenue correctly? That you don't really hear about that, you know, anymore because of all the things that have gone in place.
And just to piggyback on that, you know, if you look at the rights of shareholders now and the kind of issues they're raising in board meetings, is everything from, you know, voting on new board members if that proxy access rule passes, voting on compensation of the CEO, social issues, are companies involved in environmentally unsafe practices, a whole milieu of issues that are now raised by shareholders and customers. And I know as a board member, if something goes wrong in some company I'm involved in, I get hundreds of emails. They now have my email.
Come directly to you.
Come directly to me as a board member. And
Yeah.
that's a very different environment
different
than
dynamic.
15 or 20 years ago.
Well, all of you have mentioned the issue of culture. So, Scott, let me have you start the answer to this question and give us your thoughts. And one of the things that's important is, what is the most important element in American business in establishing an ethical culture? What is the most important thing?
Right.
Because I don't remember as long as 15 years ago as much discussion about culture and how important that was. Obviously it was, but we are talking about it as the role of the leader, the CEO. And so what is the most important in establishing the kind of culture that really drives ethical behavior?
Well, I think it's this mix. So, you know, we've mentioned products, we've mentioned communities around us, you know, is this stakeholder mix and recognizing that they're there. So we operate in 32 countries, and I can tell you that's 32 different cultures. You know, in fact, we've got different cultures across many countries. So it has to have a consistency around what are we here to do, and what outcomes do we want to drive. And for us, and I think the single most important thing is consistency across those. Not that there aren't going to be tensions, and there will be, depending on what you do for a living and where you operate. But I think the single most important thing is a consistency across leadership and down to every person, so it gets back to the tone to the top, from the top, and then actions you take and what you instill every person with. Because I fundamentally believe corporations are made of people, right? And you have to have everyone aligned around what your goals are and what these norms of behavior, regardless of where you are in the world. And I think if you get that right, I think it resonates with people's sense of what is right. Doesn't mean there won't be aberrant behavior from individuals on occasion, but I think it starts there.
So by alignment, you're talking about a common understanding
That's right.
that there is alignment among members of the organization around those key deliverables and what values or principles you're talking about
Right.
in the way we accomplish
Yeah.
those performance objectives.
Yeah, and it has to be balanced across different constituents. It can't be just shareholders.
Yeah, you know, and I would say the companies I see that do this really well actually do state their values, and everybody knows them. And then you see companies who don't. If you ask some companies, what are your values? They're like, I don't know, we have a mission,
That's right.
you know, or we have a vision, but we don't have values. And when that becomes a consistent, like you said, communication and peace, you have to count on that everybody in every department is going to hold each other accountable. But they can't if they don't know what the base is, you know, and where we're supposed to be. So, like I said, I've seen the successful ones be simple, clear, consistent values. So when you're in the role, in whatever level you're at, you can say, does this fit? Does this feel like this is our values in this company? When you get that icky feeling, you're like, I don't think it does.
Right.
And that's when you ask someone to go check, to ask their their peers or their boss, or hopefully never gets to the whistleblowing, kind of stage. I mean, you would hope that individuals can hold each other accountable or even clarify with each other. Does this feel right? That's what it comes down to, actually. Does it feel right?
I think the other factor is, in addition to values, and I think every company should have a statement of values. It's very important and ensure that all team members understand that. People look to the CEO. First of all, is the CEO representing those values? Is the board representing them? Are the top management folks representing those values? And if the rest of the organization sees that there's a difference between the value statement and the conduct of the folks at the top, you're going to have some real issues. So it starts at the top, and then it has to emanate throughout the entire organization. It has to be consistent, has to be well understood, and in some cases, implemented in pretty tough ways when people don't follow those values.
Yeah, I think that's the back to the loop thought, is that there has to be consequences.
Yeah.
And you're exactly right. If there's a management level that is not executing, in those values, then if people see that nothing happens, it's okay, then they're not real. They're not in place.
One of the things, Scott, you said in terms of the diversity of where you are throughout the world, how do you leverage this issue of consistency across the entire organization? How do you go about doing that so that there is that alignment you're talking about?
Well, it starts with that clear and simple communication. So we've implemented a long time something called Vision, Mission, Values, which is visiting every office every year and having a half-a-day dialogue. And it starts with the values of the company. But it's more than that. In every location, we have sustainability goals where we're involved with the local community. So it means we're connected here not just to do business. We're connected here to do more than that. And I think that creates a culture of why we're here together. And then, we talk about, is there's no right way to do a wrong thing. So that's a simple phrase we use. It's kind of the uncomfortable feeling. If you're searching for a way to do something, let's be really clear. There's no right way to do a wrong thing. So you're searching for it. You should feel uncomfortable. But I would say to the globalization, it's a real conundrum. Because here in a developed nation, we've got a lot of rights, a lot of opportunities, standard of living that the rest of the world aspires to. And then there's a real challenge between those developing countries that aspire to things they don't have yet, and the tension of those aspirations and what they expect global corporations to do. And there's always going to be that tension, whether it's environmental and how we act here versus there, how we enable people, the economic decisions we make. So I think that's period a challenge for global corporations, which most companies are today.
Absolutely. Secretary Pena, let me pose a question to you and also to everyone else, but to you first. One of the things that is interesting to me is helping to understand what is the role of the board of directors as it relates to monitoring and promoting ethical leadership in business today, and especially around the whole issue of governance. What do you think is the role of the board versus the CEO, as an example?
Well, board members today are very different than board members 15, 20, 30 years ago. And by that I mean the days when CEOs appointed their pals to their boards are essentially gone. There may be a few remnants of that, but they're essentially gone. And so today, board members are generally independent directors. I'm an independent director of 3 boards, was another board. But my responsibility is first to shareholders, then to the company, and then to management. It's not the other way around. It wasn't the way it used to be, where you were worried about the CEO all the time and being accountable to the CEO. So I'm on the audit committee of a very large company. We have an internal auditor who reports to the audit committee, not to the CEO, yes, indirectly, but independently reporting to us, and the external auditors report to us. So as a board member, we are very focused on ethical behavior. We monitor it. We understand what's happening with employee hotlines that people are complaining. We're vigilant about letters that we get or things that our friends say about how the company's behaving. And we have those discussions in our board meetings.
In the full board meeting,
absolutely.
not just in the governance and ethics committee?
No, in the full board, and sometimes in executive session without the management team present. And so for people who aren't familiar with that kind of operation, I would say today boards operate very differently. They're mostly accountable, very independent, and they ask tough questions, but very focused on ethical behavior because we know it's a business imperative. We know it's a business imperative. The company will not succeed unless it's focused on these issues and hopefully avoids the kind of unethical issues that have caused a lot of problems for a lot of companies.
And
Scott.
what we're seeing emerge also is different from the past is risk committees, right? And risk committees, it is tied to ethical behavior because the questions that they're asking is, are we putting shareholders in the corporation at risk? And that can be whether the usage of personal and exposure of personal information, cyber terrorism, those issues. Are we putting the brand at risk because of behaviors in third world countries, and how do we execute contracts? We go through a very aggressive, and I think most companies now, risk matrix. And this has to do with how are we behaving and executing as a corporation. So I think there are new structures emerging that really focus on this very connected world that you, Teresa, you were talking about.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm on 3 large public company boards too. We all have a risk officer who now reports to the CEO, and a risk committee. And these are 3 different industries, by the way: mobile communications, energy, and banking. Banking, you would expect it, but the other 2, so they're completely different industries, and they all operate under that. And the amount of time that I spend as an independent board member on these subjects is unbelievable. But I was surprised. I mean, I just not too long ago had been on the management side, to then flip over, onto the board side. I've seen both in the last 5 years, and the amount of time that we spend on either side, on these subjects is 100-fold, what it used to be.
Interesting. Well, let's open it up to anyone who would like to respond to this question now. We clearly recognize unethical leadership when we see it. How do we, what do we do, how can we recognize and celebrate ethical leadership? Can you give us some examples from your experience as to where we have really celebrated ethical behavior in your organizations? Anyone?
Well, I'm going to make a little comment on the side first, because this is what makes me crazy, is that the media only wants to hear about unethical things. So people love that. They want to hear all the bad and the negative, and when there's fabulous people and fabulous companies, it's boring. Nobody wants to hear about it. So I'm glad that you're asking that
it's
question.
an important question, I think, because
Yeah.
there are some wonderfully talented people making, at the board level as well as at the executive leadership level and throughout the organization, who do go beyond and really demonstrate in modeling effective ethical leadership. Do you have some examples within your own organizations?
Yeah, and I think you have to think about what is ethical behavior, because it's about a consistent set of behaviors
Yes.
across a broad-based set of constituents.
But aligned with the values of the organization.
Right, and I think also communities around. So
Yes.
around you. So we started with the chairman of our corporation donating all of his time to the state of Colorado to help recovery from the floods. This is setting an example that our local communities are critical to us, and how we interact with them are key. We measure very carefully across every site on the globe our sustainable interactions with the community and sustainable business practices. And we measure those quantitatively every year. And we celebrate the champions that do that best. So, internally we celebrate the sustainability champions, what sites have done. So we hold up as a model. This is something done in the UK. This was done in Japan. And the whole corporation gets the benefit from these kind of activities.
Wonderful.
So I think all of them are part of this idea of ethics.
I think there are 2 examples of how companies deal with the question of not only being recognized for ethical behavior, but discontinuing behavior that was inappropriate. So when a CEO stands up and says, we are no longer going to be doing X, Y, and Z because it was wrong, or because it had an anti-environmental effect, or we were putting certain products in food that we now realize were not healthy to consumers, they're rewarded for that. What happens at shareholder meetings is shareholders come up and they all have 2 minutes to say something.
Yes.
They will congratulate the CEO publicly for making that decision. So you get real feedback in that sense. We talked about social media, which has extraordinary impacts on companies that don't do that correctly. And so I think we're beginning to see companies make very tough decisions, publicly stating that they're going to discontinue certain operations because they realize they were inappropriate, and they are rewarded for that honesty.
Interesting. some of the companies that you advise. Teresa, do you have some thoughts?
Well, so I think it is in the company's best interest to begin to expose their own stories, because those stories, those great
Very
stories, are
important.
inside their own companies, and that's where the communications people can be so helpful to get those stories out, whether it be inside the company, which you always have to realize is a leak. You know, anything that's inside is going to go outside, and so to actually let that happen, encourage people within the company to share the story about their peer or about their customer and what happened, and have that celebrated. I think is how it happens. So I think there's fabulous behavior every single day in every single company. We just need to talk about
We
it.
just need to talk about it and celebrate it,
Yeah.
for sure. In those situations in which you find a leader, let's say, I'm interested in your feedback on an individual leader inside an organization where the norms of the industry or the company have been constantly pushed. This individual leader has been asked to push the behaviors of the organization to an uncomfortable level. What's your reaction, and also what is your suggestion to leaders who find themselves in that position? Anyone can take this.
Well, being from the company that I came from,
Yes.
that everyone's probably familiar with locally, that I had a lot of those times at Quest. And I was there for 25 years, so there was a lot of, lots of executives, lots of tests, you know, on that.
Yeah.
And so I'll speak for myself first, was that you really have to just get the backbone to stand up to it and realize that that may mean you lose your job. It may mean that you're not accepted in the social circle for a bit of time, or you're not accepted at all, you know, in the office. But you really just have to dig deep inside and pull yourself up and do what you think is right, and realize that there may be consequences that weren't what you were expecting, which may be losing your job. But if it's really that wrong, it's that important to you, then you know what you need to do.
Very good.
And I think and what you're kind of you're digging into this, it's the why. You know, why am I doing what I'm doing? What is my motivation? And I think in a lot of the industries, you know, we are not a heavy industry. We're capital light. We're people. We're an information technology company at IHS, but we serve very heavy industries, starting with energy
Yes.
and oil and gas, all the way through power and chemicals. And you know, in the past and even now, in terms of greenhouse gas and other impacts on the environment, you know, these are the dirty and the dangerous. And so it's often difficult, right, where you have a social constituent and a community around you, and you're trying to balance how this company has operated for 30, 40 years to a new reality, either of water usage and emissions, or where you might have other waste, and managing difficult issues that you might have inherited. And often it puts you in a conundrum, both with the company, with shareholders, and in the community. And I see that all the time. And so you're on the vanguard of changing behavior and accepting responsibility. And I think you have to start with why. You know, why am I going down this path? Why am I asked to do this? And as long as those reasons are right, you have to hold true to your convictions. And I think you're saying, Teresa, the same thing.
Yeah.
Be true to your convictions.
Any other thoughts? Anybody?
Well, absolutely. I find more and more board members who are speaking up in board meetings and challenging past behavior of a company that was involved in something inappropriate. And those can be very, very tough meetings. I just read yesterday that a certain board member resigned publicly from a board and wrote a letter to shareholders about why he was resigning from this board, because he disagreed with certain activities that were occurring on the board. There was a split in the board, but that person made a decision. I'm leaving the company. I'm no longer a director, and this is why. I think you're seeing more of that kind of courage. It's probably not well publicized,
Yes.
but you're seeing more and more of it.
Do you think, I guess, one of the questions I'm always interested in is the role of ethical leadership in leadership development. So how do you systematize within your organization ethical behavior as part of the leadership development process of your leaders, whether you're attracting new leaders or whether you're developing internal talent from a succession point of view? What I'm asking is, rather than attending seminars or conferences or coming to the University of Denver, which is obviously a good idea, what we're also asking is, how does the organization can be successful in systematizing that process as part of the leadership development efforts of the organization? And have you seen that be successful? And what are you doing specifically? I'll ask Scott as an example first.
Well, it gets back to our definition of ethical behavior, and it needs to be a broad set of norms, right? So it's how do I operate and execute every day across all of my constituents, and if that's our definition of ethical behavior, what we've done is been very aggressive at measuring around someone and inspecting back in on them. So we have a process every year. I mean, we use 360s, but we have a formal process that allows us to measure what colleagues and constituents think of a leader on an annual basis in a quantitative way and also in a qualitative way. And I think I personally use those. So how is someone viewed in terms of their conduct if they've been put in a challenging situation? What is the cumulative feedback of the constituents around them in terms of how they lead and how they manage? I think those are some of the tools that we can use. Training is something we're pretty aggressive about. But I think that multi-level feedback on how a person acts and behaves and the way we go at it is very much geared towards that. Mm-hmm. Are they enabling you? What is their motivation and focus? So without going through all the detail, but it's a way to get a view of how a person thinks about their role as a leader and then how they execute that role. And I think those are pretty critical.
I think modeling the behavior is probably the first most important thing, that all the way through, I mean, people watch, and so they mimic, and so in any level of management, you need to be the model, for the rest of the groups. Mm-hmm. But I absolutely agree with what Scott's saying is that there are so many feedback tools that are available now, and great companies that are developing these, that get not to, did I hit my sales number, did I hit my expense number, but how am I viewed as a leader, how am I perceived, how do I communicate, and are my decisions the norms of the company. And the peer, I mentioned this when I started, yep. It's the peers that have to enforce each other, either accept you as a person that is part of this company or not. And it happens quickly. If you have the right tools in place where people can freely give feedback, you know you're going to get it. I mean, it's hard to receive that sometimes, but to be, that this is how our company operates. We're a feedback, company.
I mean, the one that I like the most is one of the specific questions that we ask is, and ask people to answer, I'm respected for my skills and contribution. And that's one I go to every time, right? Mm-hmm. If you have a leader who has a set of constituents that say, that as individuals interacting with that person, I'm respected for who I am and my skills and ability to contribute. These are the litmus tests, mm-hmm. right, of behavior that gets at, is it ethical, is it balanced, and gives you confidence in how someone's going to behave in a range of situations.
Good. One of the things that I've been interested in is, you read the papers, everything that's been happening lately in a lot of different organizations. Secretary Pena mentioned, obviously, one locally here particularly. What do you think is behind the apparent widespread either gender bias, possibly, in corporate cultures of, let's say, Silicon Valley? And we've been reading a lot about that, including Kleiner Perkins, Facebook, and Twitter. Thoughts about that?
Well, it starts at the top. Look at the small number of women who serve as corporate board members.
That is really apparent,
yep.
isn't it?
Yep.
I mean,
it hasn't changed, by the way.
It hasn't changed. Yeah. So if you don't have representation at the highest level of the company, how is that notion?
It's not going to cascade.
It's not going to cascade. It might accidentally if you have an enlightened CEO who sort of gets it, but it starts at the very top. I was delighted to see that today there are 2 women running 2 of the largest accounting firms in the United States. Yeah. That's extraordinary. Mary Barra is running General Motors.
Yes.
And so every day there is progress, but I find that in engineering-related corporations, like car manufacturers, there is a paucity of women in top leadership. Maybe that's part of the reason that in Silicon Valley you don't see a lot of women who are being encouraged to be promoted and to be recruited to be part of those companies. But other than that, I think it starts at the top.
Starts
again.
at the top.
But here's back to the whole pressure thing, is that as those companies get pressure on them, I think they'll be forced to change it. And that it's only going to come from all the people in this room and all the people everywhere, to shine that light and say, what is this about, Twitter? Half your customer base is female, if not more, probably. And so why don't you have that representation? How can you possibly be developing products for your customers when you don't have that lens on your board or in your management team? I mean, how can that be?
No,
And
very good question.
you now have independent groups like Diversity Inc. and other monitors
Yes.
of corporations, and they rate companies. How well are they doing in diversity, including women representation on the board, top management, and companies follow that. They read that, and they're very
Yeah.
sensitive to having a very low rating on diversity. And so those external forces, I think, are also having a positive impact.
And it's
to
been
make
researched
sure-
to death that the top performing companies have male and female representation
Yes.
at the top levels.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know how many more statistics can be done,
Right.
to actually to prove it, but yet it still, seems to be. It hasn't moved at all. The numbers
I
haven't
think
changed.
it also starts at the bottom, though. We're sitting here in a university, right? And
Yeah.
I've spent time with at Colorado School of Mines, great Colorado
Yes.
institutions. I was sitting at a table of energy CEOs, and I have a long energy background, engineering intensive. And so one of the chairmen of one of the world's largest energy companies asked the table, so how many female executives? How many females are running energy companies today? And we kind of, started scratching our heads, and we started coming up with small suppliers. Then we moved to General Motors, and then we moved outside the industry quickly. And we spent a few minutes on this, and I think we're sitting here in a university. It also starts at the bottom. We have to encourage, diversity in education. If you talk to folks at the School of Mines and the Board of Trustees, the biggest issue is getting, attracting talented, diverse young engineers to enter the programs. So it starts at the bottom, and I completely agree with the comments at the top. But it's going to take time for these to come together, and we need to be working both ends of it.
That's why I wrote my book, by the way.
Is that why you did? Did you bring your books?
Yeah, I should start selling them.
Yeah, start selling.
But the reason I wrote it, actually, it's called The Balanced Myth, is because what happens is the schools, not necessarily engineering, but 50% of the graduates are now females.
Yeah.
50% of the workforce is females. Yet around mid-career, they exit, and they exit either emotionally or physically. So there isn't even people to pick from. I mean, I found myself in this situation, even though I was at the top of a company. I couldn't gather enough other women to promote because they weren't there anymore.
I see.
They weren't, moving up in the ranks.
And what
and
needs
so-
to be done to address
Well, so
that?
there's lots and lots of answers, but my focus all the time was around women feel like they have to be this perfect person. A perfect mom, a perfect wife, a perfect daughter, a perfect sister, and it's not possible, and yet society has created this myth around what balance means and how you're supposed to do it. And it's just not that way. And so the reason I wrote that was to share my stories of how I got to the corner office, still married to the same guy, and have 2 sons who are not drug addicts and often something. I mean, they're both in college and both doing fine. So I think there is a support, to your point, in the middle. So they get through college, but they don't get to the next level. And I had lots and lots of women in my office telling me, don't give me this promotion, don't give me this next project, because I can't do it. I can barely get here Monday morning. Do not give me more work. Do not give me something else.
I like the idea of people
so-
to pick from, and so that's the debate we've had.
Yeah.
Is so when we've made choices for the next leaders, and this is what we decided about 2 years ago, is I was looking at the reality, and we don't have enough choice in diversity.
Right.
So we started examining, what are we doing wrong that we don't have that choice? Why is it only a selection of men or that are the choice for this next job? And we've gone back and said, and I think it's kind of to your point, at the middle levels, how are we ensuring we're giving a broad base of experience to a diverse group? And actually focusing on those moves that either show them the path, now there has to be balance in that, but then allow us a broader choice. And I think you have to make a conscious decision about giving experience to people. I mean, I'm sure that's why the roles that you've had the privilege to have and that all of us have is because we've been given opportunity to broaden ourselves.
Right.
I think there are 3 things that can be done, and I've seen it happen already. Number 1, you rate the bonus of the CEO based on meeting diversity
yeah,
goals.
that's right, it does
That
work.
used not to happen years ago. But now in some major corporations, the CEO knows that maybe 5% of their 100% talent to get their bonus depends on their success in
Yeah.
attracting women or promoting women, having more diversity. Number two is we monitor our top executives in terms of what they're doing to prepare for succession planning. Are they mentoring women around them to get them ready to replace them in terms of succession? And if we find that people are not doing that, then they're talked to. You're not doing it.
There's accountability.
Absolutely. And number three, understanding consumers. There are finally a lot of companies waking up and saying over 50% of our consumers, in some cases more than that, are women. We have to have women in top management in order to be a successful company. So those forces are changing. The last thing is millennials. There are a number of them here in the auditorium tonight, but the more I read and understand the ethics and values of millennials, companies need to be much more flexible in terms of work habits and the work environment to allow for women to succeed. Otherwise, they'll not be able to recruit, attract, and keep very talented women in their companies unless they adjust.
Great point.
Critically important. Those are great suggestions too, Mr. Secretary. Let's turn to the audience. I've got a sense that there's probably a couple of questions in this audience, and we would like to engage you. So please, as we go through this, we're going to have people passing microphones, and we would love to have you stand up, tell us your name, and please ask the panel questions. On the left side, over here, please, so is our first one.
Raises a point that Adam Smith and his pal David Hume and even Neil Ferguson, the new Adam Smith, the professor at Harvard, have raised, that businesses self-regulate by virtue of the fact, don't they, that if you have an unethical peer, Teresa, you either avoid or ostracize them because they'll crush you, unlike in a government environment where it persists. So a question I have is, what percentage of business people are unethical, and how often are they unethical? Do we have a bias here that's a false belief that if we're always unethical, we don't have business, do we?
You're not asking me, are you?
I'm asking any of you.
He mentioned your name at least twice, as I recall.
Well, that's like a really loaded question.
Business wouldn't
Yeah.
sustain, would it, if the majority of people were unethical all the time?
Right, I think that's true. Right. And that's really where I started too, is that we hold each other accountable, and that it wouldn't sustain, right? I mean, you will be put out of business by society, by your customers, by your shareholders, by the bankers, if you continue to do it. I mean, the pressure is just unbelievable. I think what we struggle with right now is, where is that line? What is ethical and what isn't? What is to you may not be to me, and that's where the norms come in of society defining that, and it keeps changing, quite often.
There's some research, and I was at South by Southwest recently, and there was some research that was presented precisely on that comment, and it gets back to corporations are made of people. So it's really fascinating that how you get people to cheat, right? And what dialogue or discussion do you have at which they'll cross a line and do something unethical to gain more money? And it was fascinating research, and it was when you put the outcome in the context of getting more money, people were, the average person, all walks of life, willing to cross the line. If you then said this was an exercise about your behavior, and even used the word ethics or something like that in it, the volume of cheaters went from like 60% down to 5%. And it kind of gets to the culture and tone of the top. Human nature, people can be guided to behaviors, right, by the tone and the environment you set around them. And so I think, it's in our best interests, right, to self-govern and create these cultures and environments.
The other point that we should talk about is that what was considered ethical 20 years ago is now considered unethical. 2 examples. Use of corporate planes. 20 years ago, the CEO used a corporate plane. It was sort of understood and accepted that that was a perk. Taking gifts from people you're doing business with. In the old days, that was acceptable. If you were selling or buying product from company X and that person gave you a gift, no problem. Today, major corporations have very strict guidelines. If the CEO takes a corporate jet, the audit committee reviews it, and if it's used on personal time, they pay for it. Specific rules on what kinds of gifts you can accept from someone you're doing business with.
Yes.
Whether you can get a personal loan from the company. So there are all these new standards that are in place today, which 20 years ago were not considered unethical. But I think because of changing society and attentiveness to these things, people are now bound by a higher standard.
Absolutely.
And it should be.
We want to seek other questions. That, by the way, please give us your name. That first question was offered by Chris Pelly, a colleague of ours. Can I go to the, all the way up? Have you guys, wherever you guys who are carrying the microphone, see someone who has a question? Let's pass it. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Joseph Masmini. I was an MBA here at DU. And my question is, how does ethics, or what's the implication of ethics when the pay scale is so different from the CEO to the lowest employee? I know there was the recent story about the fellow in Seattle who decided to cut his $1 million paycheck down to $70K so that all his employees could at least make $70,000.
See, I think that's not a question of ethics. That's a question of good business judgment. And the SEC is now coming out with rules which will now evaluate disparities between CEO and top management compensation and other employees. And those ratings are going to be coming out, and people are going to look at those. But frankly, I think it's frankly good business practice. If your employees realize that you make 10,000, multiples of their salary, you're going to have disgruntled employees. So if you're a smart CEO and you want people to stay in your company, reduce turnover, and have people adopt your values and work hard, you've got to find a way to have some kind of sensible compensation policies without somebody from the outside coming in and telling you you're acting in an unethical manner. That's the way at least I look at it.
Other comments?
There's plenty of examples of where it's out of balance, and we see them in the media all the time. So, I think you got to put those aside, and then as you build a company, as people rise in responsibility, a couple things should happen. They should see the opportunity for their pay to increase, and that pay should be increasingly at risk. What corporations do, and they spend a lot of time with boards looking at their peers. Now, if the levels are all off, then the peers are all off. So I won't go there, but I will say, to your point, smart corporations incent people as their careers and responsibilities and risk go, and more of that pay should be at risk. And there needs to always be a balance. And I think there's certainly plenty of times where it's been out of balance, and we all got to look at ourselves as executives and at our companies and do the things that ensure that we're successful and retain and attract great people. So,
And you've recently read about some companies that are increasing their minimum wage, Starbucks, Walmart, others. Now, there's two sides to that story, I'll grant that, but at least they're doing it. And that's something that perhaps they wouldn't voluntarily have done some time ago. Another example, healthcare. We had a discussion on one of the boards that I'm on about healthcare and whether the company should have a slight increase in expenditures by providing health care to the employees. And we concluded that it was a great tool to retain our employees. We had 150% turnover with certain levels of employees, and we said, let's ensure that they have health care. It may cost us a little bit more money, but it's a great business practice because they'll stay. So I think smart management teams, smart companies are beginning to look at these issues a little differently than perhaps they did a few years ago.
and there's we also need to be careful. And again, I think the question is the right one and the focus is the right one. And the higher you get in an organization, that compensation needs to be at risk. So you have a base comp that is rational and the rest is at risk, and those have to be significant risks. But also when we see a lot of these metrics, global corporations like us, if you want to compare the average salary of someone in India or in Malaysia, there's disparities around the world, and so we have to be careful about what these metrics tell us and what we're mandated to do. But the question is the right one, and the responsibility is a significant one.
Thank you for the question. Please, right here, the gentleman on the aisle, and then I'll come over on this side, right there. Okay.
My name is Bob Blen. Just so you know, I'm a corporate graduate of a few decades, so I have a bias. And my other part is that I've been supporting organizations for another 20 years after that. And the question I really want to ask is there a distinction between legal and moral? And let me just clarify this, because I come out of a world that the dialogue that I hear, and it's a biased one, it's only mine, but what I hear a lot of discussion, and I hear it here too, and it's right, there's a lot of laws and regulations and the right thing to do governed by law. But the dialogue doesn't seem to be, well, what's the right thing to do here? What's the fair and equitable thing to do? if it's legal, that seems to be the end of a lot of conversations. So I just wanted to know what your take was on that. When we talk ethics, are we talking moral decisions as well as legal ones? Is it just legal, or is it moral too, the right thing to do?
It's a great question.
Yeah, so I think it's, my personal bias is that it leans to moral, because it is, ethics to me is this the right thing to do? Not that it's legal. I mean, I guess I just kind of assume you're doing legal things, so that's sort of like the bottom is it is legal, what we're talking about. But that doesn't mean it's right, or it doesn't mean that we should do it. And typically this comes up a lot with customers. Should we do this to our customers? Should we charge them for this? Should we treat them with that? What should be the repercussion when I'm just thinking about my wireless world right now, of when they leave their phone or they leave their contract. So those are the kind of decisions you have. It's not a legal question at all. It's what's the right thing, to do for the customer. I think environmental questions are like that too. That the base is legal, but then all the decisions you make, from then on are moral, to use your word. And to me, that's what we're talking about tonight, which is the ethics part of that. I think my comment earlier was that companies have been forced into certain situations by legalities now, but that doesn't mean things have gotten any easier on the moral side or on the ethics side, because those real ethical questions that you get asked every day are the tough ones. And typically, customers, environment, your constituents, there's no legal definition around those. So
No,
this
and
is my
there's-
personal opinion.
There's no amount of law that gets you the right thing, but I think we should be clear about what we did here tonight. We got together ahead of this, and we very clearly crafted a definition of what we were talking about. And I have it right in front of me here just to make sure that I was clear as I was speaking and addressing each of the issues. And you've heard me talk about it, but I'll
Please.
paraphrase it.
Yes.
So business behavior based on rights across a broad base of business and social constituents and moral norms. So we all agree that that's what we were here to discuss when we talked about ethics. And I think it's this idea of moral and more than one constituent is pretty key.
Very important. Good question, though. Right over here, ma'am, please.
Hi, my name's Jennifer Rudolph, and I'm a communications director. My question has to do with the idea of celebrating ethics, as we talked about earlier. And I'm curious to know if making these efforts of companies public and sharing these initiatives that companies do, is there a point where we end up basically ethics washing our audiences when sort of using it as a cheap marketing tool?
I don't think so. Were you asking the question of any one of
Just
us?
to the general
Yeah.
panel.
Look, there's at least two problems. One is, as was stated earlier, there seems to be more of an interest on the part of generalized media to focus on the negative and not so much on the positive. So because of that, companies who are smart start using marketing as a way to showcase their good behavior. And so you'll see ads by major companies saying, we did so-and-so to help Mrs. Jones in Arkansas who was hit by a flood or tornado or whatever, and you're seeing more and more of that because companies realize that unless they begin to market their ethical behavior, their good judgment, the good things they're doing for citizens and communities with contributions or employees donating their time to United Way, for example, folks will never know about it. And so in a sense, companies have no choice but to be more aggressive about talking about the good things they're doing. And I think that's the appropriate thing to do. They're almost compelled to do it.
I don't think you can overdo it at all.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just not enough of it. And if you think of the brands that pop in your head, even while we're having this conversation, they do it a lot.
Yeah.
And it becomes their brand. It's not just, it's about their ethics, but it is their brand now. You think of them and you have this good feeling, when you buy from them and when you think about them. So keep going, do more.
We're a long ways away from that.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because I think it's a good question because it's decisions by companies to open the dialogue. So Starbucks recently, what kind of dialogues do they want to have as you're getting your coffee? I think people are thinking hard about it, and there's more bad out there than good. So I think we could start by let's talking about what we're doing that makes a difference.
Absolutely. Please, I'm going to go over there on the left-hand side, sir, behind Chris. Yes.
To use a social science concept. And there's a real battle over what should be regulated, who should be regulated, and who controls and defines regulation. So where does where do you all draw the line as a panel? Because Maynard Keynes of Cambridge and von Hayek of London School of Economics both have polar opposite views. Overregulation was a sin in Hayek's view, and then regulation was necessary in Keynes's view. And I think that's one of the great debates in this country. And millions of people either fall on one spectrum or the other, or right in the middle. And I'm concerned that overregulation is a real threat as well for ethical purposes too. So I'd like to know where each of you stand on that.
I guess.
I answered the last question first. It's your turn.
It's that side of the room over there that's just kind of, you know.
No, I'll be happy to jump in, and I think let's put this in context. You know, what's happened over the last 10 years is globalization. We've become a much smaller world. Almost everything we touch has a global origin. And the other thing that's happened simultaneously is a collapsing of supply chains. So supply chains are thinner, fewer sources of supply, and we're much more global. And as a company that helps other companies comply and report, it's not just what happens here. There is not consistent regulation in any country in the world, and the cost of understanding and meeting that regulation is massive. Reporting in every jurisdiction in every country, you take every state here, is different. Now imagine you operate around the globe. So the idea, you know, that regulation could be the driver in that matrix of complexity is maybe the definition of insanity. So let's start with that. But there are certain cases where I think behavior has to be guided at the right level. And we talked about this. Now, you know, Enron and SOX hasn't sent anyone to jail, but I think it's been a vehicle to change the tone from the top and change culture inside of companies, right? So it's cost us a lot. Has that regulation been a good thing? I think 10 years on, the outcome of it is it's helped us change behavior and cultures potentially. So I think it's a balance, and I don't think there's a simple answer to that. Governments can't tell us how to behave as individuals. They can't tell us how to behave, what's the right moral thing as corporations and individuals inside corporations.
You know, I agree it has to be a balance. Let me give you two examples. I remember back in the 1970s when the government required automakers to install seatbelts. And the automakers protested. They said it would be too expensive, they'd go bankrupt, and also they weren't going to work. Well, turns out they did work. They saved thousands of lives. And guess what? Companies didn't go bankrupt. A few years after that, the government came and said, you ought to have airbags. Same arguments. Can't have airbags, too expensive. Now companies are advertising that they've got 15 airbags in their cars as a marketing tool. So the question is, was it appropriate for the government back in the 70s and 80s to require more higher safety standards because the industry would not have done it? I would argue yes. Here in this state, we're having a great debate on fracking. Should there be more regulation of fracking or not? Should it be balanced? I think it should be balanced. So there is an appropriate role for regulation. What happens, unfortunately, is when there are disastrous activities by certain companies, government overreaches and overreacts and passes legislation which goes too far, and then 10 years later it has to come back. And that's just the nature of at least our country, a democracy in which people vote and elect members to Congress and presidents, and they respond to voter opinion. That happens, and that's the cost of doing business in the United States.
And my answer is it is a pendulum swing in different industries. So I'm a little bit where you are there, that you can't just make this general statement, but if you look at industry specifically, there's a pendulum that swings, and it sometimes goes too far right and sometimes too far left. And I could say certain industries are over-regulated right now, and others could use a little bit. You know, so I think it's not a broad-based question. And I absolutely agree with you that when something bad happens, we overreact to it as a society, and then it has to be inched, back again. So,
Great question. Thank you very much. On this side, can I get someone? Yes, please, sir. Can I all the way up there?
Is it ethical for that beam to come over here because of the cost of compliance of ethics? I mean, the U.S. has gone is very paranoid about ethics. You're all talking about the cost. We have environmental ethics costs. We have consultants for ethics costs. We have HR ethics costs. And earlier, Teresa, you said, hey, and our company does this. We say, is it the right thing to do, whether it's an employee or a customer? And sometimes I'm cynical, and I say, The right thing for the Aztecs was human sacrifice. But by the right thing to do, there's a cost for it. And as long as you can pass the cost onto the consumer, much like the airbag, because in the 70s, a car cost, I bought one, $7,800. And now that same car costs $78,000 if you want a Denali or something. So it's all been passed on. But in the case of steel, it's not. So is the ethical thing, or is it right, should we put a tariff on products that don't have the same structure that we do or cost for ethics?
Well, I start from the premise that ethical behavior is a business imperative. You shouldn't do it because you're being forced to do it. You should do it because it's the right thing to do. Customers will love you for it, and you're going to make more money as a corporation if you engage in ethical behavior. And so if there's a cost to it, you factor that in as any other cost you have for the company. But I would argue strongly that at the end of the day, the cost-benefit analysis of ethical behavior is extraordinary. In the case of foreign products, we already have some limitations in this country. I remember when China tried to import wallboards that were awful. What happened? They were sent back to China. Doesn't happen all the time, but I think companies around the world are now recognizing that if you're going to import products in the United States, there are agencies that monitor that and try to ensure that those products meet the same safety standards that American products do. And consumers figure that out right away, very quickly, and they'll say, don't buy from that country, because as soon as you buy something from that country, it'll fall apart in 3 days. We've seen that. And so I think over time, those ethical costs balance out, and even smart companies overseas will understand that ethical behavior, at least in terms of products in the United States, will inure to their benefit over the long term.
Thank you. Sir.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank my section for cheering for me. My name is Alfonso. I'm the managing partner of Vertex Learning. We've talked a lot about the millennial generation, but we've got a new generation coming behind them called Generation Z. And my grandson, who's 4 years old, can manipulate my iPhone, but he can't tie his shoes. And I fear that he will grow up in a world where he does not ever have to look at a human being in order to transact business. And so we continue to see every year at Christmas time, the holidays, the percentage of sales online versus the ones who walk through the door and transact face to face. Do you believe that the advent of this e-commerce will lend itself to more corruption and unethical behavior in the future? And do you believe it is efficacious for institutions like this one and or our public school system to begin looking at building digital citizens through digital citizenship curricula so that we might be able to build up from the ground up a generation who fully understands what ethics really means?
Terrific question.
What
Thank
was
you very
that?
much.
I want to repeat that. Digital, what did you say, digital? That's interesting, yeah.
Well, to answer the first part of your question, no. I don't believe that digitization and what is happening to your grandson and my 9-week-old grandson will somehow encourage more unethical behavior. I think there will be more rapid communication, more self-reporting, more vigilance by people looking over everybody else's shoulders, which I think will militate against unethical behavior. Now, whether schools should begin to focus on the question you have asked, I think that's a good question. For example, look at the abuse that we've seen on certain Facebook postings, or how some people, we won't go into specifics, have embarrassed other students by inappropriately using technology. They're paying heavy consequences for that conduct. Unfortunately, it happened. So I think you're right. We've got to educate folks about how to use all these new tools in an ethical way so that they're not abused and misused, and in some cases with deadly consequences.
Yeah, I love that term, though. So I do think that, it's just like our parents looked at us and said, we were crazy, we're going to look at them and say they're crazy. And so things move and they move with it. And I find myself more in touch with my children because of texting and online things, than I was ever with my parents, So I think there's good that goes with it, and there are definitely new things. But there is a new norm forming around what is acceptable when you're communicating that way. We've all seen it. People are really, really aggressive when you can just type it and you don't have a face to look at and a reaction. And you would never say that to someone, in person, but you'll say it, in an email or in something like that. So I think that's going to also self-governance a little bit, that people are saying enough with that and that's not acceptable. And I love that term because I think there's something to that of what does that mean,
Probably there's more feedback and response than we've ever had. So
Yeah.
I think what it does is it gravitates to social norms, right? And as long as those are evolving in the right way, but it's an enabler of great dialogues. We have an internal social network that we started as a collaboration tool because we're so spread, and you don't control the dialogue that happens. And we decided that this is an opportunity to and it's amazing the things that crop up on it. And we were encouraging those groups of people that have certain interests in certain types of food that are connecting themselves across the world, and discussions on all kinds of things about how we might accomplish certain goals. And so the connectivity actually breeds a lot of new energy, new intellectual energy, and I think they also are as we see that with our kids, they self-regulate each other pretty quickly. We have to be careful about the dangerous consequences, but I think it'll move to social norms.
Yes, sir. Please, hand up.
Thank you. How do you do? I'm Don Richards, MBA 1983. Let's talk executive hiring. To the extent that a corporation can avert a potential ethical risk with an executive candidate, you have ameliorated some of that potential problem. Could you describe for us how your companies are effectively incorporating that into your candidate application and review and interview? How are you attempting and successfully assessing a candidate's ethical character?
Well, for good or bad, a lot of us now rely on search firms, which go out and come in with 5 or 6 candidates, and they've done a deep dive, and hopefully they've done a deep dive on ethical behavior, criminal records, all those sorts of things. Sometimes they miss those. But secondly, I think it's up to those of us who are responsible for conducting the interviews to use very good judgment in reviewing that information and asking the right questions. And it's interesting what you can elicit from an individual that you don't even know by asking a completely innocuous question, and the way they answer it or their simple body language sends you a signal that something's not quite right here. And so you try your very best, but I have to be honest, we make mistakes. I've been in situations where I hired somebody that I thought was going to be remarkable, and a year later it turned out not to be the case, and I just used the wrong judgment. And you hope to minimize those mistakes, but that does happen. So I think getting as much feedback from as many different sources, whether search firms or others, or doing your own independent review and investigation of potential candidates, is your best, at least, certainty to make sure you're going to avoid a terrible mistake.
I think it's really long interviews, and it is, to your point, the engagement of that. So it's not a drop in my office for 30 minutes because the search firm's done everything, but that you're spending a lot of time. My thing that I always used was to get the person outside the office. So as the final interview, it was somewhere else, even if it was as simple as a dinner or a lunch or anything that was out of the office, to just see how that environment works. And you pick up a lot on how someone treats the wait staff.
That's right.
How they order off the menu, what they eat and drink, drinking in particular. So you can pick up a lot of things by getting someone out of their formal interviewing process and see what's going on there. And at the end of the day, you do a judgment call and you're wrong sometimes. And then it's quick action, I think, to take care of it. So.
I think there's a lot of tools, and you use them all. Assessment tools, there's a range of old and new assessment tools that give you a bunch of views on how people think and how they behave and how they act.
We have time for a couple more questions. I want to look to the back, and I'm looking in the light way back there. Ma'am, I see you in the middle. Yes, ma'am. Please.
Could you do the right thing for a wrong reason?
The right thing.
Well, it depends on what you mean as the wrong reason. Is, for example, excessive profits the wrong reason? I mean, it depends on what you mean by the wrong reason. So
I think it's an interesting question. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, maybe, and again, I think Starbucks, great company, and they're really focused on doing the right thing for customers. And we've probably all seen over the last 6 or 7 years, I'm in Starbucks a lot, that they've gotten a lot more customer focused. Now, should we have a dialogue in Starbucks with the manager over diversity? That you know, that may feel like the right thing to do while I'm getting my coffee. You know, maybe that's an example of what you're talking about. You know, the right thing for the wrong reasons. You know, I think there's lines at which we can participate in people's lives, and they expect us to do that. And then there's a line at which we've probably over-participated, whether it's advertising or, you know, you probably see it in wireless. So that's a good question to ask ourselves. Right? You know, there's no right way to do a wrong thing, but is there wrong reasons to do a right thing? Maybe there is. I like the idea of it.
Very good. Last question from the audience? Yes, sir. Over there. Can I get you?
My name is Cooper Hopkins. I was an undergraduate student back in 2011. And I wanted to speak directly to what Mr. Pena said as far as kind of the shifting work habits of the millennials. I would definitely argue that kind of the definition of ethical behavior has shifted as well. And I'd be curious to know, kind of in your experience serving on multiple boards, kind of what efforts and conversations are occurring in that board meeting when, in the large part of corporate America, the millennials are not represented there.
believe it or not, boards are now talking about adding millennials to their boards. And a few young people in their 30s, by the way, are now serving on corporate boards. That wouldn't have happened 5 years ago. Companies are becoming very insightful about consumers, and they get it. They know that my generation, which used to be the largest cohort, is no longer the largest cohort. It's the millennial generation. You're the consumers. And so smart companies are beginning to understand, and we talk about this specifically, how do millennials think about products, ethics, values, corporate responsibility? Do they care about whether we're involved in communities? And all the answers are yes, they do. And they monitor your behavior. And so I think it's good business judgment to focus on millennials. And I think over time, we're beginning to see younger and younger people being added to boards to try to reflect consumers, just as more women are serving on boards over time, hopefully, minorities and others, to make sure that people are beginning to understand consumers. It's a smart thing to do.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. Let me ask the panel a question in closing our questions this evening, and ask them to, what advice would you give to the Daniels students that are here today, as an example, in their role, and what could their role be in promoting ethical behavior in leadership in the future? How do you see their role, and what advice would you give them?
So I would say one of the first things is to ask yourself where your rudder is. I mean, in their early stages, because I'm assuming generally, younger, is, do you know where your ethical line is? And if you do, great, model it, behave it, and live it. If you don't, and you're not sure, that's a little bit of work for you to do about yourself, because I come full circle here that it's each of us as individuals that have that line, and as a leader, you then model that behavior and you expect it, from your groups, but you have to know where you are first and get solid on that.
Yeah, I think, and as I look back across many years, what do you want to achieve? Because your behaviors are driven by the goals you set for yourself. And I think thinking long and hard about what those goals are. If those goals are crossing certain lines, whether it's monetary or achievement or otherwise, I'd ask yourself, I'd suggest you ask yourself a little bit more about the journey. Because your behaviors are all about where you want to end up, and that's the goals that you set. And what you'll find out is the more interesting path is one that's more flexible, one that allows you some richness in your experience. And that starts with a broader sense of what you want to achieve. And so I think you're right. Where's your rudder, and where do you want to end up? And your behaviors are going to be guided by that. Your ethics are going to be guided by that. And I think the richness of your career is going to be driven by the expanse of those interests and those goals. So I'd think hard about those as you enter the business community.
I would agree with both those observations. The one other thing that I would urge you to think about is this. Imagine if every millennial who was applying for a job somewhere in this country asked the interviewer, what are your values as a company? Where are your ethics? I read in the paper the other day that you did X and Z. What are you doing about that to correct that? That would be a powerful influence in encouraging corporations to be more mindful of ethical behavior if their future workforce is asking those kind of tough questions of those companies. Absolutely. It would affect them in extraordinary ways, not just because you are the future workforce, but you're the future consumer. And so you have an ability to influence corporate behavior in ways that perhaps you haven't thought about yet. It's risky to do that in an interview, but it gets back to the question here. What is your moral compass? Do you want to work for any company, irrespective of their values? Probably not. And would you more want to hear from a CEO or someone doing the interview that they share your values? Yeah, that's the company you probably want to work for and give a lot of your time and sacrifice and energy to. So something to think about.
Let me add just a final thought about that same question. Because I have the opportunity to mentor a number of students at the University of Denver who are involved in the MBA program. And one of the questions I ask is, please think about the following question. What does success look like to you? It's a difficult question to answer possibly, but it's not to understand. What does long-term success look like? And then as you begin to connect with those organizations and those people who are going to be influencers in your life, then you want to see how much alignment there is between what you have defined as current success. You may change your mind later on, but really think about what does success look like to me, and where are those organizations and influencers that you can partner with that can help you achieve your goals and objectives long term. It's an exciting time for all of you as graduate students, I know that. I want to thank all of you for your questions tonight, for your participation. Would you help me thank our panelists? Dr. Sweeney is going to conclude the evening. Right?
I was going to come up here and take some of that applause, but thank you very much. What a great conversation. I was sitting up in the top for most of it, and it was just a wonderful conversation. I want to thank Federico and Teresa and Scott and Ted for just a great job. And let's give them another hand.
Well done.
And I want to thank everyone here in the audience for, one, great participation, excellent questions, insightful questions. You kind of understand the issue very well. Thank you. And thanks to everybody who's watching on the internet, wherever in the world you may be. And thank you again for your participation in this important dialogue. I mean, this is a conversation that has to keep going on, and I want to thank you also for being here and demonstrating your investment in the promotion of solid ethical leadership in our economic institutions. A special thanks, I don't know if any of them are still here, to our student volunteers from my Profiles in Leadership MBA class. And yes, they are volunteers. I didn't pay them with any grades. So thank you very much. And let's be sure to try to keep this dialogue going. We've got a fairly robust website. There's new stuff going on there every day, well, every week. So check in once in a while, see what's going on, take part in the conversation, send us your opinions. We'd love to have you part of the conversation.